Society called her a spinster at 35, but a ruthless cowboy waited 10 years to love her. Margaret Ellis had lived in the small town of Cheyenne all her life. Cheyenne was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and nothing happened without being noticed. People took pride in knowing who was marrying whom, who was expecting children, and who had inherited what. Life moved slowly, measured by seasons, church gatherings, and the rhythm of the local ranches. For many, it was comforting. For Margaret, it was a cage. She was 35 years old, and the townspeople had already decided her fate. In a place where women were expected to marry young and start families almost immediately, Margaret's single status had become the topic of countless whispers and sideways glances. At 35, she had already been labeled a spinster. The word carried judgment, pity, and a hint of disbelief, as if anyone who had reached her age without a husband had somehow failed in life. She had grown used to it over the years, but the sting never fully disappeared. Margaret had always been careful. She had loved once deeply when she was younger. It was a quiet, tender love, the kind that makes the heart flutter and the world seem brighter. She had been engaged to a man named Thomas, a charming young man who promised her the life of her dreams. But Thomas had left town in pursuit of opportunities far away in Houston, chasing the allure of oil and wealth. He never returned. The heartbreak left Margaret cautious, and for a while she had buried her feelings deep inside, focusing instead on the responsibilities that life had handed her. Her family had always depended on her. Her father, a gentle man with a love for books and learning, had built a small bookstore in the heart of Cheyenne. Margaret had grown up among shelves stacked high with novels, encyclopedias, and dusty tomes filled with knowledge. She remembered spending hours curled up with her favorite books as a child, feeling that stories could take her anywhere, even when the town felt small and confining. When her father passed away, Margaret had taken over the bookstore. It became both her refuge and her responsibility. She managed the shop meticulously, ensuring that the shelves were organized and the books cared for, and she kept the business running despite the small-town challenges. Margaret was independent in a way that few women in her town could be. She knew how to manage money, repair the small issues in the shop, and care for herself and her mother. Yet, society did not value these qualities. What mattered to the townspeople was a ring on her finger, the ability to host dinners, and the number of children she could bear. Margaret's intelligence, kindness, and resilience went unnoticed by most. People only saw that she was 35 and unmarried, and that alone was enough for them to dismiss her as someone who had somehow fallen behind in life. Every day, Margaret would open the bookstore and greet the few customers who came in. Travelers passing through the town often found themselves enchanted by the shop's cozy atmosphere. Children loved visiting because of the picture books Margaret would read to them, often letting their imaginations run wild in a corner of the store where pillows and rugs created a little reading nook. But the same shop that brought joy to others also reminded Margaret of the loneliness she carried. She had no partner to share her life with, no companion to walk with her under the wide Wyoming skies, and no one to share the quiet moments that filled her days. Even with her responsibilities and her love for the bookstore, Margaret sometimes allowed herself to imagine a different life. She pictured what it would be like to wake up beside someone who cared for her, who understood her past and accepted her fully. She imagined a partner who would join her in quiet evenings by the fireplace, sharing stories and laughter without judgment or expectation. But each time she allowed herself to dream, the weight of reality pressed down. She knew that in Cheyenne, people were rarely given the luxury of choosing their own timelines. Life for women like her was measured in marriages and children, and the clock was ticking loudly in the ears of the town's gossips. Despite the whispers and the judgments, Margaret carried herself with dignity. She did not complain, she did not argue, and she never let the scorn of others touch her pride. She smiled politely when someone asked why she was still unmarried, and she replied with grace when relatives suggested that she should settle for anyone willing to marry her. Her patience was both a shield and a silent act of defiance. She refused to let society dictate her happiness or her choices. Margaret's daily life was a careful balance of work, responsibility, and quiet solitude. She spent mornings arranging books, assisting customers, and occasionally visiting the market for supplies. Afternoons were often spent managing the store's accounts or repairing worn shelves. Evenings were her own, filled with reading, reflecting, and walking through the town when the streets were nearly empty. She loved the quiet of those walks, the way the sun dipped behind the distant hills and painted the sky in shades of pink and orange. In those moments, she could almost forget the judgment of society and feel a sense of freedom that was otherwise rare in her life. Her mother's health had been declining for several years, and Margaret had dedicated herself to her care. She managed the household, prepared meals, and ensured that her mother's days were comfortable and filled with dignity. The responsibility had slowed her personal life, but Margaret had never resented it. She loved her mother deeply, and caring for her was a choice rooted in love rather than obligation. Still, it meant that her own desires, her own chances for companionship, had to wait. And as the years passed, she watched friends and neighbors marry and start families, while she remained in the same familiar routine. The townspeople, meanwhile, continued to speculate about her future. At church gatherings, women whispered behind hands, questioning why Margaret had not yet found a husband. At local markets, men would nod politely but speak with a tone of gentle condescension, as if her unmarried status were a blemish on the town itself. Children, innocent as they were, sometimes repeated what they had heard from adults, asking why Miss Ellis did not have a husband or a family. Margaret met all of this with patience, kindness, and a quiet resilience, understanding that gossip often reflected the insecurities of those who spread it rather than her own worth. Margaret's life was not without moments of joy, however. She had a small circle of friends who respected and loved her for who she was. They would visit the bookstore, sharing stories, laughter, and support. On rare occasions, she attended social events, though she often felt out of place among younger women who were celebrated for their beauty, charm, and marital prospects. Even so, these moments reminded her that she was not entirely alone, and that genuine connections could exist even in a town that valued conformity over individuality. Despite the judgments, Margaret had developed a quiet strength. She had learned to navigate life on her own terms, to find contentment in her work, and to appreciate the beauty of small moments. She had become adept at reading people, understanding their intentions, and responding with measured thought rather than impulsive emotion. Her intelligence, resourcefulness, and empathy set her apart, even if the town did not always recognize it. And then there was Daniel Hayes, the man who watched her from afar. He was a rancher, known for his discipline, strength, and a certain ruthlessness that earned him respect in Cheyenne. But Daniel's reputation did not intimidate Margaret. In fact, she had noticed him many times over the years, quietly observing her, never intruding, yet always present. She had seen him help others without seeking recognition, maintain his land with meticulous care, and carry himself with a quiet confidence that spoke of years of hard work and perseverance. Daniel had admired Margaret from the first moment he saw her, but he never approached her directly. He understood the weight of her responsibilities, the pain of past heartbreak, and the quiet life she had built around herself. He respected her independence and her strength, recognizing that she did not need rescuing, only someone willing to wait, to understand, and to appreciate her fully. 10 years passed, and the town's whispers continued, but Margaret remained steadfast. She continued her work, cared for her mother, and nurtured her small circle of friends. The bookstore flourished under her careful management, becoming a beloved fixture in the town. Travelers would leave with warm smiles and recommendations for their friends to visit, and children would leave with excitement in their eyes, dreaming of the stories Margaret had shared. Through it all, Margaret held onto a quiet hope, though she rarely admitted it even to herself. She wondered if she would ever find someone who could see her for who she truly was, beyond the societal labels and the judgments of others. She imagined a love that would not be rushed or forced, a companionship that respected her past, her strength, and her independence. And though the years had made her cautious, they had not extinguished her capacity for hope or her belief that life could still hold unexpected joys. Her days continued in this rhythm: books, care, small pleasures, and quiet reflection. The town remained the same in its routines, its judgments, and its expectations. Yet within Margaret there was a world of depth, resilience, and unspoken dreams. She had not failed. She had not been forgotten. She had simply been waiting for the right moment, the right person, and the right love. And little did she know, that person had been near all along. silently observing, understanding, and patiently waiting for the moment when Margaret's heart could finally be ready for love again. Daniel Hayes had always been a man of few words, but when he noticed Margaret Ellis, words weren't always necessary. He first saw her 10 years earlier when she was 25, standing outside her bookstore, negotiating with a supplier twice her size. The man was gruff and impatient, and his tone was sharp, but Margaret remained calm. She spoke softly, yet her words carried authority. She never raised her voice. She didn't argue aggressively. She simply explained her position clearly and held her ground. Daniel had been passing through town that morning on business, checking on one of his ranches. He paused to watch from a distance, leaning against his horse, observing the way Margaret handled herself. There was a quiet strength about her, an independence that drew him in immediately. It wasn't the kind of strength that shouted or demanded attention. It was the kind that commanded respect simply by existing. And Daniel respected it deeply. Over the years, he found small reasons to cross paths with her. He would stop at the bookstore occasionally, ostensibly to purchase a farming manual or a book on ranch management. Sometimes he brought apples from his orchard or fresh eggs from his farm, leaving them politely on the counter for Margaret to accept or not. Their conversations were brief but meaningful. He asked about books, about small-town events, about things that mattered to her. She would smile politely and respond, never fully aware that the quiet man standing in her store was observing her with a deep and patient care. Daniel was not like other men in Cheyenne. The town had many ranchers, farmers, and businessmen, but few possessed his combination of discipline, patience, and quiet determination. Some called him ruthless, but it was not cruelty that earned him that reputation. It was the way he ran his ranch with unwavering focus, making difficult decisions without hesitation, protecting his land and workers alike, and maintaining an almost obsessive sense of responsibility. Yet despite this stern exterior, he had a gentle heart reserved for those he cared about deeply. Margaret was one of them, though she had no idea at the time. For Daniel, love was never impulsive. It was never about fleeting emotions or social expectations. When he saw Margaret, he recognized a woman who had lived through hardship, heartbreak, and the judgments of society. He knew she had been abandoned by the man she once loved. He understood that she had sacrificed much for her family and had carried burdens quietly, without complaint. Loving her from a distance was not only a choice, it was a way to respect her life and her independence. The town continued to talk, and their gossip reached every corner of Cheyenne. At church picnics, women whispered about Margaret's single status. At the market, neighbors would raise eyebrows when she walked alone. Younger women, married or engaged, often treated her with a mix of pity and judgment. But Daniel's perception was different. He saw Margaret's courage, her intelligence, and her kindness. He admired the way she managed her bookstore, the way she cared for her mother, and the way she treated people with patience and respect, even when society was cruel in its judgment. Despite his feelings, Daniel never pressed. He knew timing was everything. Love, he believed, should not be rushed or forced. Margaret's life was already full of responsibility, heartbreak, and caution. To approach her too soon would have risked adding burden rather than joy. So he watched and waited, patient as the years slowly passed, knowing that one day, when the circumstances were right, he could offer something that would truly honor her strength. Meanwhile, Margaret remained unaware of the depth of Daniel's admiration. She noticed him occasionally, certainly, as one notices a quiet presence, but she never considered that he could be different from the rest of the men in town. Most suitors she had known either approached her for appearances, financial advantage, or fleeting companionship. Daniel was unlike anyone else. His attention was steady, patient, and entirely genuine, though she did not yet realize it. Over the years, Daniel became a quiet fixture in her life. He never intruded, never offered unsolicited advice, and never sought recognition for his small acts of kindness. He repaired the bookstore's broken sign without announcing it, brought fresh produce during harvest season, and occasionally left notes recommending books he thought she might enjoy. Margaret appreciated his gestures but often assumed them to be casual kindness, unaware that each act was carefully measured, motivated by respect and a deep, long-standing affection. As Margaret's mother's health slowly declined, Daniel noticed the quiet strength that Margaret displayed. She never complained about sleepless nights, doctor visits, or the endless work of caring for her family. She managed everything with dignity, ensuring that her mother's needs were met while still keeping the bookstore running. Daniel saw in her not just responsibility, but an extraordinary courage. He admired the way she prioritized others while rarely taking time for herself. Through all of this, the town continued to whisper. People speculated endlessly about Margaret's future, assuming that someone as intelligent and capable as she must be difficult to please. They did not understand her past heartbreak, her sacrifices, or the quiet satisfaction she found in her work and independence. They only saw a woman who did not conform to society's expectations, and they judged her harshly for it. Daniel, however, judged nothing. He only observed, respected, and waited. Over time, their small interactions built a silent connection. When Daniel visited the bookstore, he listened more than he spoke. He asked questions, paid attention to details, and remembered things that others would have overlooked. Margaret unknowingly began to feel a quiet comfort in his presence. He never pressured her, never offered empty compliments, and never acted impatiently. In a world that rushed love and judged women harshly for their age, Daniel's patience was a quiet rebellion. He understood that true love required more than just desire. It required timing, understanding, and a willingness to stand beside someone without overshadowing them. For Daniel, Margaret was worth waiting for. 10 years of careful observation, gentle acts of kindness, and silent support were not wasted time. They were preparation. He needed to be certain that when he finally revealed his feelings, he could offer her stability, respect, and unwavering commitment. During these years, Margaret continued her routine. She greeted each day with diligence, ran the bookstore with care, and fulfilled her duties to her mother. On quiet evenings, she walked through the town, reflecting on her life and sometimes imagining a different future. She dreamed of companionship, of someone who would understand her fully, and yet she remained cautious. Her past heartbreak had taught her the value of patience, even if society had not. Daniel watched all of this quietly. He noticed the small moments that no one else did, the way her eyes softened when she spoke of her father's favorite books, the way she laughed when children shared stories in her reading nook, and the way she carried herself with quiet pride despite the whispers of society. He admired her resilience, her empathy, and the strength that had allowed her to navigate life with dignity and grace. The 10-year span was not without its challenges. Both Margaret and Daniel faced their own trials, responsibilities, and moments of doubt. Margaret struggled with loneliness, societal judgment, and the weight of her obligations. Daniel faced the harsh realities of running a ranch, maintaining his land, and supporting his family. Yet through it all, they remained connected in small, meaningful ways, their lives subtly intertwined despite the distance and the silence. Daniel's patience was not passive. He took care of things quietly, ensuring that when the time came, he could stand beside Margaret as an equal partner, offering love and support without conditions. He did not rush her or impose his desires upon her. Instead, he waited for the moment when she could be free from burdens, when she could accept love without fear or hesitation. Meanwhile, Margaret's world continued to revolve around her bookstore, her mother, and the quiet rhythm of her life. She had learned to find joy in small moments, the smile of a child discovering a new story, the satisfaction of arranging a perfectly organized shelf, and the peace of walking through the streets of Cheyenne at sunset. She had also learned to protect herself from the judgments of others, understanding that their words reflected their own fears rather than her own worth. Even as the years passed, Margaret remained unaware of the depth of Daniel's feelings. She noticed his occasional presence and his acts of kindness, but she never realized the quiet love that had grown over a decade. She assumed he was simply another neighbor, another rancher doing his part in the community. Yet every thoughtful gesture, every visit, every conversation had been a careful thread woven into the fabric of their unspoken connection. As Daniel continued to watch from afar, he also began to understand the subtle ways Margaret's heart had healed and grown stronger over the years. He recognized her courage, her independence, and her ability to navigate life with resilience. He knew that she would never settle for something less than what she truly deserved, and he respected that completely. His love was patient, steady, and unwavering, built on years of observation, admiration, and understanding. By the end of the 10 years, a quiet tension had built between them, not one of conflict, but of anticipation. Daniel knew that the right moment would come when Margaret was ready to accept love fully, without fear or hesitation. Margaret, unknowingly, had grown accustomed to his presence and kindness, feeling a subtle comfort she could not yet name. The stage was being quietly set for the next chapter in their lives, a chapter that would finally bring their long-simmering connection into the light. Life in Cheyenne moved steadily, as it always had, but for Margaret Ellis, the rhythm of her days began to shift quietly after her mother passed away in the early spring. Her mother's death left a space in her life that was both heavy and unfamiliar. Margaret had spent decades caring for her, ensuring comfort, dignity, and companionship. She had baked the breads, cleaned the house, and tended to her every need. And now, with her mother gone, the house felt larger and emptier than ever. Margaret wandered through the rooms, touching small items that carried memories. A quilt her mother had stitched, worn yet still vibrant with love. A set of teacups that had never broken, though they had survived years of use. Each object reminded her of the quiet life she had lived, the responsibilities she had carried, and the love she had given without expectation. She felt pride, yes, but also a loneliness that she had long kept at bay. For the first time in years, Margaret realized she had no one to care for but herself. Her bookstore became both a sanctuary and a challenge. She immersed herself in work, trying to push aside the emptiness that pressed on her heart. She sorted books, rearranged shelves, and welcomed the occasional travelers who wandered into her shop. Children still loved the little reading nook she had created, and their laughter brought moments of comfort. Yet, no matter how busy she kept herself, a quiet longing lingered. She had spent so long caring for others, watching the years pass, and now she could not escape the feeling that something essential was missing from her life. Then came the storm. It arrived one afternoon with no warning, clouds rolling in from the western plains, wind whipping through the streets, and rain hammering the rooftops. By evening, the storm had flooded several buildings on Main Street, including Margaret's bookstore. Water seeped under the doors, warping the wooden floors and shelves. Books lay in puddles, their pages bent and soaked. The familiar warmth of the shop felt threatened by the flood, and Margaret felt a surge of panic she had not expected. She stood in the middle of the shop, surrounded by ruined books and splintered wood, her heart heavy. For a moment, she considered giving up, imagining how impossible it would be to repair the damage alone. The town's whispers about her single status and age returned to her mind, sharp and painful. She had managed so much on her own for so many years, but the flood felt like an overwhelming force, one she could not simply ignore or solve by herself. It was then that Daniel Hayes arrived. He came quietly, without fanfare or announcement, as though he had simply appeared by instinct. He had heard about the storm and the damage it caused, and he had brought help with him. Workers from his ranch followed, carrying tools, wooden planks, and supplies. Daniel didn't speak much. He simply assessed the damage and began to work. He rolled up his sleeves, lifted soaked books, and started repairing shelves. Margaret watched, at first too stunned to speak. She had not expected anyone to offer help, let alone someone as steady and capable as Daniel. For 3 days, Daniel and his workers labored in the bookstore. They repaired the floors, reinforced the weakened shelves, and carefully dried and preserved as many books as possible. Daniel worked silently, focusing on the task, yet his presence carried reassurance. Margaret found herself watching him, noticing the patience in his movements, the care he gave to every detail, and the quiet determination that had always drawn her attention from afar. On the 4th evening, the sun set behind the hills, casting golden light over the damaged but slowly restored bookstore. Margaret and Daniel sat on the steps outside, exhausted but satisfied. For the first time, Margaret felt the weight of the past 10 years lift slightly. She finally allowed herself to breathe, to feel the relief of having her sanctuary saved. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the rustling of the evening wind. Daniel looked at her, his eyes steady, and replied simply, "Because you never asked anyone for help." Those words hit Margaret in a way she did not expect. For years, she had shouldered her burden silently, believing it was her responsibility to manage everything alone. She had never considered that someone might care enough to offer support without expectation or judgment. And yet here he was, standing beside her, not asking for anything in return, simply helping because he could and because he cared. Over the following days, their interactions began to shift. Margaret started to notice the small things Daniel did that went beyond mere assistance. He remembered which books she preferred, noticed when she seemed tired, and offered help before she could even ask. He asked about her well-being, about her thoughts, and about the dreams she had long kept hidden. Margaret, who had been so cautious for so long, felt a connection that was gentle yet undeniable. For the first time, she realized that Daniel had been present in her life in ways she had not fully recognized. All those years of quiet observation, small acts of kindness, and patience had not gone unnoticed, though she had only now begun to understand their depth. The man who had once seemed distant and untouchable was now close, his presence comforting rather than intimidating. Margaret found herself talking more openly than she had in years. She spoke of her mother, of the years of responsibility she had carried, and of the loneliness that sometimes crept into her life, despite the bustling bookstore and the laughter of children. Daniel listened, never interrupting, never offering shallow reassurances. He simply heard her, validating her experiences by his attention and his understanding. As they spent time together, Margaret began to notice the patience in Daniel's love. He did not rush her or pressure her for anything. He did not speak of marriage or expectations. Instead, he offered a consistent presence, a quiet reliability that contrasted sharply with the transient attention of the men who had once courted her. In his patience, Margaret began to feel a sense of safety, a sense that she could be herself fully without fear of judgment or abandonment. The turning point came subtly, in moments of shared labor and quiet conversation. As the bookstore slowly returned to its former state, Margaret and Daniel worked side by side, exchanging smiles, stories, and small jokes. She began to see the man behind the reputation, the disciplined rancher with a heart capable of deep love and understanding. She recognized that his patience over the years had not been indifference, but a careful and deliberate form of devotion. One evening, after the last shelf was repaired and the bookstore was tidied, Margaret and Daniel sat together outside. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the town quiet after the storm. Daniel turned to her and spoke, his voice steady but soft. "I have cared for you for 10 years, he said. I have waited because you deserved someone certain, someone who could stand by you without hesitation." Margaret felt her heart race. 10 years. A decade of silent attention, of unseen support, of love that had been patiently nurtured from afar. She realized that the man sitting beside her was not just a helper or a friend. He was someone who had understood her, respected her, and cherished her long before she could even recognize it herself. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to consider the possibility of love again. Not the impulsive, reckless kind of her youth, but a steady, patient love built on understanding, respect, and unwavering support. Daniel had waited, not out of impatience or desire, but because he valued her enough to allow the right moment to arrive naturally. In that moment, Margaret saw clearly the difference between society's shallow judgments and the depth of true connection. She had spent years trying to live up to expectations that were never truly hers. She had carried burdens silently, protecting herself and others. And now, for the first time, someone had chosen to stand with her, not because she was young, beautiful, or socially desirable, but because of the strength, courage, and compassion she carried within herself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold, Margaret realized that life had not abandoned her. She had not been forgotten. She had not missed her chance. True love had not been absent. It had been waiting patiently across the years, quietly observing and preparing to arrive at precisely the right moment. Daniel's presence, patience, and unwavering support had created a turning point in her life. The flood had destroyed her bookstore temporarily, but it had also washed away the final walls Margaret had built around her heart. In the aftermath, she could see clearly the love that had been present all along, waiting for her readiness, waiting for the moment when she could fully accept it. And so, after years of caution, responsibility, and solitude, Margaret began to step into a new chapter of her life. One where love was not rushed or forced, where patience and understanding were the foundation, and where she could finally embrace the possibility of happiness alongside someone who had waited a decade to love her fully and without condition. After the storm and the repairs to the bookstore, life began to feel different for Margaret Ellis. The familiar rhythms of her days remained. She still managed the store, sorted books, and helped visitors, but something had shifted in the air. Daniel Hayes' presence was no longer a quiet background in her life. It had become steady, reassuring, and comforting. She noticed small changes within herself, too. For the first time in many years, she felt lighter, freer, as if a weight she had carried for decades had begun to lift. At first, their interactions remained gentle and careful. Daniel never rushed her or demanded attention. He simply shared moments of companionship, sitting together over cups of tea in the bookstore after a long day, walking along the dusty streets of Cheyenne as the sun dipped low, and occasionally laughing over small misadventures in the shop. Margaret found herself opening up to him in ways she had not with anyone else in years. She spoke of her past heartbreak, of her mother, and even of her secret dreams, things she had never shared with the townspeople who judged her, or even with friends who did not fully understand her quiet heart. Daniel listened with patience. He did not interrupt, advise too quickly, or offer shallow comfort. He only listened, nodded, and sometimes, when the moment was right, he would speak in a soft voice that carried care and understanding. Every word he said seemed deliberate, and Margaret began to realize that his love was different from anything she had known. It was steady, unwavering, and built not on desire alone, but on respect, observation, and a deep understanding of who she truly was. As weeks turned into months, Margaret and Daniel's bond grew stronger. They worked side by side in the bookstore, repairing old shelves, organizing books, and even planning small improvements to make the shop more inviting for travelers. Daniel helped her with heavy lifting, but he also encouraged her creativity, suggesting ideas for new book displays or cozy reading corners. Margaret began to see him not just as a helper, but as a partner, someone who shared her interests, respected her independence, and quietly supported her in every way possible. Even in their daily routines, love began to flourish. On warm afternoons, they would sit outside the bookstore, watching the town go by and sharing stories from their past. Margaret learned about Daniel's childhood on the ranch, the challenges he faced when he inherited failing land, and the ways he had worked tirelessly to turn it into a successful operation. Daniel learned about Margaret's life growing up in the bookstore, her responsibilities to her family, and the quiet dreams she had nurtured through years of work and solitude. In these shared stories, a deep understanding and trust blossomed. Margaret also began to notice the small, thoughtful gestures that Daniel had made over the years. The times he remembered her favorite books, the way he offered help without being asked, and the quiet patience he had shown in observing her life without judgment. These gestures were no longer invisible. Margaret began to recognize them as expressions of love. She realized that Daniel had been building a foundation for their future for a decade, patiently waiting for the right time to show her that she was valued, cherished, and worthy of love. One evening, as autumn approached and the air grew crisp, Daniel invited Margaret to walk with him along the edge of his ranch. The golden sunlight filtered through the trees, painting the landscape in warm hues of red and orange. They walked slowly, side by side, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward. For the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to feel truly seen. She realized that Daniel's presence in her life was not a fleeting comfort, but a steady anchor, a reassurance that she was not alone, and that love could exist even after years of waiting. As they reached a quiet clearing, Daniel stopped and turned to her. His eyes held a tenderness that Margaret had come to trust, and his voice was soft but full of conviction. "Margaret," he said, "I have waited 10 years because you deserved someone certain, someone who would never leave, someone who would honor the life you have built. I waited because I believed that love should not be rushed, but earned through patience and understanding." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. For so long, she had feared that love had passed her by, that society's judgment was correct, and that she was destined to live a life of quiet solitude. And yet, here was a man who had not only waited but had loved her consistently, deeply, and without expectation. In that moment, she understood something she had long forgotten. True love is not measured by age, appearances, or societal approval. It is measured by patience, care, and unwavering commitment. Over the following months, their relationship continued to grow. Margaret allowed herself to lean on Daniel in ways she had never done with anyone else. She shared her dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. Daniel, in turn, continued to offer his steady presence, never rushing her, never demanding more than she was ready to give. Together, they found a rhythm that blended their lives harmoniously. The bookstore, once a place of solitude, became a shared space filled with laughter, conversation, and the warmth of companionship. Their love also brought subtle changes to the town. Those who had once whispered about Margaret's unmarried status began to notice the shift in her demeanor. She walked with a quiet confidence, a gentle smile that reflected a newfound contentment. Daniel's presence at her side was noticed, but their love was not ostentatious or dramatic. Instead, it was built on shared respect, understanding, and mutual admiration. Slowly, the town began to see that Margaret's worth had never been tied to age or societal expectations, but to the strength, kindness, and resilience she had always possessed. Eventually, Daniel decided it was time to propose. He chose the bookstore, the place that had shaped Margaret's life, that had been her refuge, and that had witnessed the quiet development of their connection. He had planned carefully, as he had with everything in his life. There were no grand gestures, no extravagant displays, just a simple, heartfelt declaration of love that spoke directly to Margaret's heart. "Margaret," he said, holding her hands in his, "I have waited 10 years for this moment. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Margaret felt a rush of emotions, joy, relief, and a profound sense of being truly seen and understood. She realized that her long wait, her patience, and her cautious heart had led her to this moment. Without hesitation, she said yes, knowing that she had finally found a love that honored her past, her strength, and her independence. Their wedding was quiet but deeply meaningful. Family, friends, and a few townspeople who had grown to admire their patience and devotion gathered to witness the union. There were no grand decorations, no extravagant celebrations, just a simple ceremony that reflected the genuine love and respect between Margaret and Daniel. Margaret wore a simple dress, and Daniel wore his usual ranch attire, both comfortable and true to themselves. The day was filled with laughter, smiles, and quiet tears, a testament to the journey they had shared and the love that had finally blossomed. After their marriage, Margaret and Daniel continued their lives together, blending their routines, responsibilities, and joys. The bookstore became a shared project, a place where they worked side by side, welcomed visitors, and nurtured a sense of community. The ranch continued to thrive under Daniel's care, with Margaret offering her insight, support, and ideas. Their days were filled with meaningful work, shared responsibilities, and moments of quiet companionship that strengthened their bond. Over time, the town's perception of Margaret changed. Those who had once whispered about her being a spinster now saw her as a woman who had lived with dignity, patience, and strength. They admired the love she had found, a love built on understanding, patience, and unwavering support. Margaret never spoke ill of the town's judgments. She simply lived her life as proof that timing does not define worth, and that true love is never bound by age or social expectations. Years later, Margaret would occasionally walk through the bookstore, now filled with new shelves, reading corners, and memories of shared laughter. She would glance at Daniel, tending to a customer, repairing a shelf, or simply watching her with quiet pride, and feel a warmth in her heart that words could never fully capture. She knew that their love had not been rushed, forced, or bound by societal rules. It had grown naturally, patiently, and fully, a love that had waited 10 years to arrive and had done so perfectly. Together, they built a life rooted in respect, patience, and mutual admiration. Their story became an example quietly shared among the townspeople, a story of hope, perseverance, and the beauty of love that waits for the right moment. Margaret often reflected on her past, understanding that every choice she had made, every year she had waited, had led her to this life, a life filled with the kind of love she had once thought impossible. And so, Margaret Ellis, once labeled a spinster by society at 35, found not only love but a partnership that honored every part of her. Daniel Hayes, the disciplined and patient rancher, had waited a decade to show her that love is not measured by speed or appearances, but by understanding, commitment, and a willingness to wait for the right time. Together, they proved that true love arrives when hearts are ready, not when society dictates. In the quiet town of Cheyenne, where whispers once shaped judgments, their story became a testament to the power of patience, the strength of character, and the enduring nature of love. Margaret and Daniel lived the rest of their days side by side, quietly happy, deeply connected, and profoundly grateful that love had arrived at precisely the right time.